Welcome all. I'm joined today by CivilNet host and analyst Eric Hacopian to discuss the larger context of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and its implications for Armenia and Nagorno-Karabakh. So Eric, thank you again for your time.
It's a pleasure.
In terms of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, many analysts believe that Putin's plans have been slowed or thwarted. At the same time, Russian forces have made significant advances in certain areas and have surrounded cities like Kiev and Mariupol. What do you think is the current state of the war?
Well, since none of these analysts knew what Putin's plan was, it's very hard for them to judge what's failed and what succeeded. What we do know is this: the Russian advance has been slow. The Ukrainian resistance has been very strong, and in fact, the Russian military has underperformed on many levels. However, at the same time, it's very clear, and it's become even more clear over the last couple of days, that the Russian side is winning the war just by sheer number of force. They have much greater forces, and they can afford much greater loss of equipment and troops, and they are advancing on all fronts, and they have surrounded all the primary cities in Ukraine, or at least on eastern or central Ukraine. While they are slowly closing the southern coast. Mariupol probably falls over the next couple of days, if not because they can't last much longer. So they'll essentially have the entirety of the coast from the Russian borders all the way to Crimea, close to where Odessa is. So they're essentially closing the coast while they are advancing on different fronts slowly. I'm not even sure if they're ever going to really go into Kiev, because as we know, there are significant negotiations going on directly between these two sides to end this war. There's a very good report about it in the Jerusalem Post. So I think overall, the only thing that's changed since the last time we spoke is that the Russians have made far greater advances at great cost to them and with significant Ukrainian resistance.
When observing this war, what was different about this conflict compared to other conflicts you've observed?
I think there's two elements here. I think there's a very pedestrian element, which is sort of the issues of today, which is, NATO expansion or Putin's ambitions or fears, however you want to put it. But I think there's a larger context to this, and I think this is almost a civilizational conflict in a way. If you look at it, you almost have to go back 1,000 years to get an analogy that's actually useful. Russia is sort of the stand-in for the Byzantine Empire, and in many ways it actually is. And if you look at the West, which is no longer led by Rome, but it's led by Washington and Brussels as its junior partner, are sort of the equivalent of the Crusaders. They're obviously totally secular, but I think their zeal is the same, of imposing a particular worldview on the world. So I think this is, one thing that's sort of telling here is the Chinese role here. If you look at it, all the primary countries that the West has problems with in the world, or actually the United States has a problem with the world, Russia, China, and Iran, are countries that are civilizationally will not fold under the Western umbrella. That they have an identity of their own, despite the fact that Russian culture is very much part of Western culture, but it's a different pole of Western culture. So I think that's one of the differences that I think makes this harder to end, because it's really about different visions of the world in some ways. So I think it's going to be harder to end that conflict. The first one can end, the practical one. I think this one is one that goes on. And you sort of see it, the sort of vehemence, this cultural vehemence of, banning Dostoevsky and banning, this sort of this very aggressive, sort of an anti-Russophobia, the Russophobia as we would call it, is... some of it is that the civilizational aspects that are given away by the vehemence of that, because that was never done, for example, to the U.S. after the 2003 invasion, which most of the world opposed. There's almost this zeal about it that I think it's not your normal political conflict.
And that's really interesting that you speak about the civilizational aspect and the zeal that is behind it. But how does Armenia, which is neatly placed between all these powers, fit into all this?
Well, it really doesn't matter how Armenia wants to fit into it. It's the perception of Armenia that matters. I think Armenia civilizationally is actually tied to both. We're Western and Eastern, so we're in some ways we get the benefit of that. In some ways, we get the brunt of that. But I think if you look at Western attitudes, and I mean this culturally, what I call the Christians of the East that are not subordinate to the Western power systems, whether it's the Serbs, whether it's the Armenians, whether it's on some level the Greeks, as far as their attitudes go, are always seen as the cultural other. And that's why, you're talking about NATO, you're talking about Russia invading Ukraine. Well, Turkey has been occupying an EU member for almost all of my life, and no one says a word. And you see these attitudes. They'll take the Azeri side over the Armenian. They'll take the Turkish side over the Greek. They'll take the Bosnian side over the Serbian, because they think anybody that could be possibly allied to Russia losing is a good thing, no matter what the specifics are. So I think we sort of get the brunt of that attitude that comes to us. And I'll give you a perfect example that was probably heading our way, sometime over the next 6 months to a year, especially what's going on in Turkey right now. They're probably heading towards some kind of a default, or they're going to need a bailout. And I will guarantee you that the terms that they will get for that bailout are far more favorable than what the Greeks got, which was essentially to starve the country for the next 50 years to pay debts that are unpayable. I will guarantee you that Turkey will get a much better deal than the Greeks ever got. And I think that's driven by almost this civilizational angst or hostility on some levels.
Mm. And I want to ask also about the Russian exodus to Armenia. I was just in Georgia, and though Tbilisi was full of Russians as well, the anti-Russia sentiment was palpable. There were reports even in Georgia of businesses denying services to Russians, for example. However, in Armenia, though there may be anti-Russia sentiment in some sectors, it hasn't panned out in that way. What do you think about this Russian exodus, and what do you think about Armenians' reaction to this exodus compared to Europeans and Georgians, for example?
Well, I think Georgians have very specific problems with Russia that are related to their territory or territories that they claim or are legally considered to be part of Georgia and Abkhazia and Ossetia. So obviously they have very specific issues with the Russians. I think broadly, the Armenian culture is frankly welcoming to all kinds of people. It's not, again, this is the juxtaposition between love and tolerance. People will tolerate you. That doesn't mean they'll love you. But this is like almost someone coming to your home. You welcome them, and you try to accommodate them the best that you can. And obviously, because of historic or national security purposes, Russia is perceived to be important for the territorial integrity of Armenia or its long-term security. People don't have the anti-Russian contingents in Armenia are quite limited, and public attitudes are not. You'll get all kinds of opinions, but I think this Russian. The attitude towards Russians coming here is a combination of geopolitical realities and Armenian culture that is generally quite welcoming, especially of guests, and you don't mistreat guests under any context or any reason.
And we have previously discussed the strengths of each side in this war, Russia and Ukraine. You mentioned that Russia has a strong military, but Ukraine is really winning the PR war. In your opinion, what are the weaknesses of each side, however?
Well, those are simple. For the Russian side, it's their primary weakness, in fact, politically, geopolitically, and historically, is that their political system, their governance system, is not something that is popular around the world. It's not something that anybody wants to emulate. In the 21st century, there's not too many Western or educated or people who have aspirations towards modernity that are looking for a czar or a czarist system, which is the current Russian system can be described as such. So I think the Russians' biggest weakness and failure is the fact that they have an unattractive political model, and it's an unattractive political model even to a great number of their people. That's why so many of them are leaving the country. And if you have an unattractive political system, it becomes really hard to sell anything. is because people don't want to emulate you. It's very hard to tell your narrative in a positive way, because people around the world do not, wake up in the morning and want to live like Russians do. They wake up in the morning and want to live like Germans do. I mean, it's just cold, hard reality. I think on the Ukrainian side, the tragedy is that I don't think they comprehend to the extent that people who are supporting them, and I mean by people as state actors. I'm not talking about individual human beings that are sympathetic to Ukraine. I mean, those are all natural, and I'm not questioning anyone's motivations, but I think the state actors are far more interested in hurting Russia than they are helping Ukraine. I think they're... Go ahead.
The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky even mentioned that there is a sense of abandonment.
They have been abandoned, and I think in real terms they've been abandoned. They're given just enough to hurt the Russians, but not enough to win. I'm not even sure they would be ever be able to win, just the disparity of forces. But on some level, there's the anti-Russian angst is far greater than the pro-Ukrainian drive.
And I mean, you've spent a great deal of time in American politics, and you observe European politics as well. Are these people really that much zealots?
I think they're zealots in the sense that there's a Western view of life that is the superior one, that people have universal aspirations of. And if you don't have it, you have some kind of a problem. On the back of people's minds, there's a Westerner, within every Vietnamese person, within every Iranian, in every Russian that's waiting to break out. And I think what they don't realize is that people aspire to certain parts of Western culture which are quite popular or actually very good. But that doesn't mean they want the total package. And I think it's almost this fundamentalist drive. And I think it's to the extent that Christianity has died in the West. This push sort of has become a religion in and of itself, in which everybody wants to live the same way. And like some things, for example, like transgendered rights that would have been quite out there, even in the West 5 or 10 years ago, now are mainstream and are expected to be bought into by everyone, everywhere, at all time, immediately, which isn't realistic. So I think, yes, on some level that zeal exists, and I think in this case the Ukrainians are just a tool in this culture war.
And finally, we have to speak about Nagorno-Karabakh. Even as the foreign ministers of Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Turkey are in the same city, in Antalya, in Turkey, in Karabakh, tensions are flaring. In the village of Khramort, Azerbaijani soldiers have used grenade launchers and mortars on the village. And, some people are getting worried about Aliyev's plan. Last time, in 2020, it was in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic when the world's eyes were fixed on that. I'd like you to comment on this. What do you think about these Karabakh tensions? Do you think that, timing is never a coincidence when it comes to these things?
No, it's not a coincidence whatsoever. I think it's very clear that he is testing the red lines. He's testing Russia's red lines. He's testing the red lines of the world. It's very clear, and he has said so in so many ways, state policy is ethnic cleansing in Artsakh, period. And if not ethnic cleansing, then genocide would be the second step. He's been very clear about this. One thing about dictators, you listen to their words, because they're far more, what they say they do, they're far more apt to do than democratic leaders, to be honest with you, when it comes to negative things. Not positive things, but negative things. So this is his goal, on what's been holding him back is the Russian presence. And you don't really know what's going on in his mind. This is obviously, it's a continued effort to intimidate people to leave, to get Artsakh back without any Armenians. That's their goal. And we don't know what's going to happen in Russia if there's, the war goes badly, there's political tensions, he will try to use that opportunity. There's no question about that. But then there's also the flip side of this. If the Russian side actually wins in a decisive way, and sort of imposes its will on the West, on Ukraine, on some levels, which looks like it's going to happen on one level or the other, then it also, he's in a bind because you're not going to ask that Russia to leave Artsakh probably ever. And he has told his people that this issue is over. Well, this issue is over. Why are you doing what you're doing now? So I think there's, he's sort of put himself in a corner. So we don't know this is coming out of strength or if it's coming out of weakness or fear. That how does he explain to his people that 3 years from now he will not ask them to leave because he knows what the consequences of that is. You see that every single day in Ukraine. Every country in this part of the world that has been acted outside of the Baltic states that have moved aggressively against Russia has paid a terrible price for it. It's just you stretch from a territory inside of Russia, from Chechnya to Georgia to Ukraine. There's a test case for that. So he understands that. So he might be just pushing the boundaries or to see what he can do in a short run to really cause some kind of an exodus. But he's got this 800-pound gorilla in the room, which is the Russians, who are not going to leave. And I think he's testing the boundaries. And he might be testing the boundaries both ways, not knowing what the outcome of this war is going to be. So, but what's important here is for the world to understand and make clear to him that ethnic cleansing in Artsakh is not going to be accepted. Because frankly, that is the beginning of having some kind of a final or a temporary long-term freeze or solution to this issue that the world frankly doesn't want to deal with. That's the key. He needs to understand that ethnic cleansing is not going to be accepted by the world at large and obviously by regional states. So it's a tense situation, but we don't really know if this is coming out of a place of strength. It probably is because they won the war. Or it could be coming out of, how he fits into all of this. He has signed a strategic alliance agreement with Russia right before the war started. But we know that was forced. I mean, that was not his preference. Just body language was very clear about that. So it's a very tense situation, and I think what the world on our side needs to show is strength, and that this is not going to be allowed to happen. It's will, and this is, to make sure that this is simply not acceptable and it's not going to be allowed to stand.
And one more question, briefly. If, in terms of the West's civilizational front, Mr. Putin flies in the face of all of that, why doesn't Mr. Aliyev?
Because you always hate what's closest to you more than something that's distant from you. It's like the Shia, and the Shia hate the Sunni far more than they hate Christians. It's because what is closer to you and similar to you but different is far more threatening than something that's entirely alien. And it's also Islamophobia, because Putin is held because of his, Russian civilization as part of Western civilization is seen as will be held to a higher standard, while because of Islamophobia, people like Erdogan and Aliyev are always kept to a lower standard because, what do you expect from these people? That's the attitude. They won't say it, but that's really the attitude. Well, performative anti-racism, maybe. Well, yeah. Eric, thank you very much for your time. Thank you. And thank you for joining us on CivilNet.